If you've been hearing people talk about investing in SpaceX and you're trying to figure out how to actually do it through ETrade, here's the truth that most videos won't clearly tell you at the start. You cannot directly buy SpaceX stock on ETrade or any public brokerage because SpaceX is still a private company. That means it is not listed on the stock market, there is no ticker symbol, and there is no button you can click that says buy SpaceX shares the way you would with Apple or Tesla. But that does not mean you are completely locked out of exposure to it, and that's where things get interesting. So in this guide, I'm going to walk you through what people actually mean when they say they invest in SpaceX using ETrade, what is realistically possible, what is not, and the step-by-step paths you can take depending on your account type, your budget, and how much risk you are willing to accept. By the end, you'll understand exactly how investors try to position themselves around a company like SpaceX, even though it is not publicly traded. First, let's clear up the biggest misunderstanding. SpaceX is a private company owned primarily by Elon Musk, early employees, and private investors. Because it is private, its shares are traded in what is called the secondary market, not the public stock exchange. That means you cannot just open ETrade, search SpaceX, and place an order. If you try, nothing will appear, because ETrade only lists publicly traded securities that are registered on exchanges like Nasdaq or NYSE. Now, even though you cannot buy SpaceX directly, there are still three main ways people try to get exposure to it, and some of these can involve using an ETrade account indirectly. The first and most common way is through public companies that are connected to SpaceX's business ecosystem. This is the simplest method and the one most retail investors end up using without realizing it. For example, companies involved in aerospace manufacturing, satellite communications, rocket materials, or defense contracting may benefit indirectly from the growth of SpaceX and the broader space economy. Through ETrade, you can buy shares of those public companies. And while it is not the same as owning SpaceX, your investment is tied to the same industry trends that SpaceX influences. So the step here is straightforward. You would open your ETrade account, fund it through your bank transfer, search for aerospace or space-related public companies, and invest in those stocks or ETFs that align with space exploration and satellite technology. The key idea here is indirect exposure. You are not betting on SpaceX specifically, but on the sector that SpaceX is heavily shaping. The second way people try to get exposure is through specialized funds or ETFs that include private company valuations indirectly. Some investment funds and venture capital trusts hold stakes in private companies like SpaceX, and when those funds become partially accessible to retail investors through public listings, you can sometimes buy shares of those funds on ETrade. However, this is not always direct or guaranteed, and it depends on whether the fund is publicly traded and whether it discloses private holdings. So if you're using ETrade, you would search for space-focused ETFs or innovation-focused funds. Once you find one that is publicly listed, you can purchase it just like any stock. Again, this still does not mean you own SpaceX shares. It just means SpaceX may be one of many private holdings inside a larger portfolio managed by professionals. Now, the third method is the one most people are actually curious about when they ask this question, and that is secondary private markets. This is where things get more complex. SpaceX shares sometimes become available through private transactions when early employees or investors sell their shares before the company goes public. These transactions happen on platforms that specialize in private equity trading. However, here is the important part that most beginners miss. ETrade is not typically a platform where you directly buy private shares like SpaceX. ETrade is a brokerage for public market securities, not a private equity marketplace. So if someone says, I bought SpaceX through ETrade, what they usually mean is one of two things. Either they invested in a fund that holds private shares, or they are using ETrade as their main brokerage while accessing private investments through a separate qualified channel. In most cases, private SpaceX investments are limited to accredited investors, meaning individuals or institutions with significant net worth or income. That requirement alone excludes most retail investors. Still, let's walk through a realistic step-by-step scenario of what someone might do if they want to position themselves as close as possible to SpaceX exposure using an ETrade account. First, you would open your ETrade account if you do not already have one. This involves identity verification, linking your bank account, and funding your brokerage account with capital you are willing to invest. Once your account is active, you would move to the research section and start looking for space industry exposure. Instead of searching for SpaceX, you would search for terms like aerospace, satellite communications, rocket manufacturing, or innovation technology, ETFs. Next, you would review the available stocks and funds. At this stage, the goal is not to find SpaceX itself, but to identify companies that either work with SpaceX, compete in the same industry, or operate in overlapping markets, such as satellite deployment, launch services, or aerospace engineering. You would look at their financial performance, risk level, and how closely they correlate with space exploration growth. After selecting your investments, you would place your orders through ETrade just like any normal stock purchase. You choose how many shares or how much dollar value you want to invest, confirm the trade, and your portfolio now contains indirect exposure to the space industry. Now let's talk about something important that most people overlook. Even if you somehow gain access to SpaceX shares through private channels, investing in private companies is extremely different from buying public stocks. There is low liquidity, meaning you cannot easily sell your shares. There is limited financial transparency, meaning you do not get the same level of reporting as public companies. And there is significantly higher risk because valuations are not updated in real time by the market. This is why most retail investors stick to public market exposure. It is safer, more liquid, and more transparent, even if it does not give you direct ownership of SpaceX. Now, you might be wondering why SpaceX itself is not public yet. The main reason is control. Private companies can focus on long-term innovation without the pressure of quarterly earnings reports and shareholder expectations. SpaceX is heavily involved in long-term projects like Starlink, Mars exploration, and reusable rocket development. Going public would introduce financial scrutiny that could slow down or complicate those goals. Because of this, Elon Musk has repeatedly suggested that SpaceX will likely remain private until its Starlink internet business matures into a stable, predictable cash flow system. That means direct investment opportunities may not exist for retail investors for quite some time. So where does that leave you if your goal is to invest in SpaceX using ETrade? It leaves you with a strategy built on exposure rather than direct ownership. You are using ETrade as a tool to invest in the public side of the space economy, while understanding that SpaceX itself is currently outside the public market system. You are essentially positioning yourself in the ecosystem that SpaceX is helping to grow, rather than trying to buy into SpaceX directly. And this is where smart investing thinking comes in. Instead of chasing one private company, you start thinking in terms of industries, trends, and long-term technological shifts. Space exploration, satellite internet, and reusable rocket technology are not just about one company. They represent an entire wave of innovation that multiple public companies are participating in. So if you are sitting there with your ETrade account open, the most practical move is not searching for SpaceX. It is building a diversified position in the space and aerospace sector, balancing risk across multiple companies, and staying informed about how private companies like SpaceX influence public market opportunities. Now let's bring everything together in a realistic mindset. If your goal is wealth building through investing, chasing private company access is usually not the most efficient path. The most successful investors focus on what is accessible, liquid, and scalable. ETrade gives you access to thousands of public securities, and within that system, you can still build meaningful exposure to industries that SpaceX is shaping. So the final takeaway is simple but important. You cannot directly buy SpaceX stock on ETrade, but you can absolutely use ETrade to invest in the broader space economy that SpaceX is leading. And if SpaceX ever does go public in the future, that same account would be one of the fastest ways to invest at that time. Until then, the smart approach is understanding the system, using public market tools effectively, and building a strategy that aligns with reality rather than hype.